Your grandfather's garden had crops you cannot legally plant today, and a few of them might already be growing next door. That sounds dramatic, but it is true in more places than most home gardeners realize. There are plants that used to be normal in American yards and even on American tables, and now they are banned, restricted, or treated like a serious problem if you plant them, sell them, or move them. Some will shock you. Others will make you pause because they were once praised as helpful before they turned into a mess. And the reasons why might change how you think about gardening forever. One quick thing before we start. Plant rules change by state, and some bans are about selling or transporting, not just planting. So if you recognize one of these, do not share cuttings, do not move it to a friend's yard, and do not toss it into regular compost until you check your local rules. Let's start with castor bean. With its dramatic star-shaped leaves and striking red seed pods, castor bean was a darling of old American landscaping. It grew tall and bold, adding a tropical look to places where most gardens stayed short and plain. It made a yard feel fancy without much effort. The seeds were also tied to medicine in family life. Castor oil was a common home remedy, the kind of bottle that sat in a cabinet for years. But hidden inside those glossy speckled seeds is ricin, one of the most deadly natural toxins people talk about. A few seeds can seriously harm or kill, and children are naturally drawn to anything that looks like a colorful bean. After World War II, as suburbs filled with young families, the risk became unacceptable. Garden clubs stopped recommending it, nurseries stopped selling it, and a lot of old plants were quietly removed from yards across America. Next comes kudzu, the plant that fooled an entire nation. During the Great Depression and Dust Bowl years, kudzu was praised as a miracle crop that could feed livestock, prevent erosion, and even help families during hard times. People pointed to edible uses too: leaves cooked like greens, flowers turned into jelly, roots processed into flour. In desperate years, any plant that promised stability sounded like hope. The government encouraged planting it because the land was blowing away and people needed anything that could hold soil in place. But kudzu had conquest in mind, not cooperation. In the right conditions, it grows at a shocking pace, and it does not stop at your fence. It climbs and smothers everything in its path, swallowing trees, sheds, fences, and whole hillsides until the landscape looks like it has been wrapped in a heavy green blanket. This is the lesson behind the whole video. A plant can look useful, even noble, and still become a nightmare once it escapes. Now step closer to giant hogweed, a plant that looks like a storybook giant. It towers over people, topped with huge white flower heads that spread out like umbrellas. Victorian-era gardeners imported it as a showpiece because it made a garden look grand and wild, like something you would see on an estate. But giant hogweed hides a cruel secret in its sap. When the sap touches skin and then sunlight hits that skin, it can cause severe burns, blistering, and scarring. It is the kind of injury that looks unbelievable until you see it, and it has happened to children who were simply playing near it and brushing the stalks. That is why it is treated as a public menace in many places. Planting it, selling it, or moving it can bring serious trouble, and removal is not something to do bare-handed or casually. Now comes a flower that looks gentle and nostalgic until you remember what sits inside the pod. Opium poppies can be breathtaking. Soft petals, pale colors, deep purples, the kind of bloom people still associate with an old-fashioned garden. The seeds were also used in baking for generations. People sprinkled them on bread and pastries without feeling like they were doing anything risky. But those same pods contain the raw materials used to make morphine and heroin. That is why the law gets involved. Once authorities decided the risk was too great, the plant stopped being treated like a simple ornamental in many cases. It became a legal problem, even when a gardener swore their intentions were pure. It is a bitter irony. A plant that fed families and beautified yards for centuries became forbidden because of what could be made from it. Now meet Japanese knotweed, the one that can wreck a property from the ground up. The young shoots can be tart and lemony, and some people compare them to rhubarb. That little detail makes it feel harmless, even clever, like a forgotten edible you might want to bring back. But once it gets established, it behaves like a battering ram. Its roots spread aggressively, pushing into cracks, lifting pavement, and creating damage that can cost a homeowner a fortune. It overwhelms native plants and turns a mixed landscape into a single stubborn patch. Even tiny fragments can start new growth, which means one careless cleanup can spread it farther. People have ended up in fights with neighbors over it because it crosses property lines and refuses to stay put. This is why it is feared, and why so many places treat it like a serious invasive threat. Now we move into water, where some of the worst invaders look the prettiest. Water hyacinth produces beautiful purple flowers and thick, spongy leaf stalks. It was introduced for water gardens because it looked like a floating bouquet and grew fast, which people thought was a feature. But the beauty masks a takeover. It multiplies quickly and forms dense mats that clog waterways, slow drainage, block boat traffic, and starve water of oxygen. Fish suffer. Native plants disappear. The pond that once looked clear can turn into a thick green carpet that feels impossible to reclaim. That is why many states restrict it hard. In some places, even possessing it is treated seriously, because once it escapes into natural water, it stops being a private hobby and becomes a public disaster. Now comes a plant that shows how laws can change everything overnight, even if the plant itself looks like nothing special. Coca is a shrub with small, glossy leaves. In its native regions, it has a long cultural history. But in the United States, it is treated as the source plant for cocaine, and the law takes a hard line. The leaves themselves are not the drug the way people imagine. It is the processing that creates the danger. Still, cultivation is treated as a serious offense because it is tied to manufacturing intent. One plant in a greenhouse can be enough to bring heavy consequences. Now picture a wetland edge with tall purple spikes waving in the breeze. Purple leucostrife looks like it was designed to make a pond look magical. Gardeners loved it for color, and beekeepers liked it because it can provide heavy nectar flow. But it produces huge amounts of seed and spreads into wetlands fast. Once it takes hold, it forms dense stands that crowd out cattails, sedges, and other native wetland plants. Wetlands are not decoration. They are nurseries for birds, fish, and all the small life that keeps the land healthy. When leucostrife takes over, the whole place changes. That is why it is banned or heavily controlled across many states. It is not just a pretty flower anymore. It is an ecosystem wrecking ball. Now meet peyote, a cactus that looks friendly but carries a different kind of trouble. It is small, round, and low to the ground, almost like a little green button. It does not look dangerous at all, but inside it lies mescaline, a powerful hallucinogen. It has been used in Native American religious ceremonies for a long time, and there is a narrow legal exemption tied to that. Outside of that, growing it is strictly forbidden. It also grows very slowly, sometimes taking many years to mature, which makes it more about ritual than casual gardening, but the law focuses on what it contains. Now, back to water again, where the next invader can turn a living pond into a dead surface. Giant salvinia looks like a soft floating fern with small velvety leaves. It seems harmless, like a little green blanket you could skim off with a net. But in warm conditions, it spreads fast and forms thick mats that cover the entire water surface. Those mats block sunlight, lower oxygen, and kill life underneath. Lakes and rivers can turn quiet and stagnant. Once it establishes, it is hard to stop. And that is why many places treat it as a major invasive threat. Now comes a tree with a sweet name and a hard personality. Tree of Heaven was welcomed in American cities because it could survive poor soil and give quick shade. It looked like a tough solution for tough places. but it spreads through root suckers and wind-blown seeds, forming dense colonies that crowd out native trees. Its roots can damage sidewalks and foundations, and it can poison the soil around it so other plants struggle to grow. Worse, it is a preferred host for the spotted lanternfly, an invasive insect that has been hammering trees and crops in parts of the country. That link made this tree feel even more urgent to remove in many areas, because leaving it standing can help the pest spread. Now let's talk about a shrub that was once pushed as a good guy. Autumn olive has small, speckled red berries that are edible, and people praised it as nutritious. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was promoted for wildlife food and erosion control. Hunters liked it because it could attract birds. It felt like a smart, helpful plant. But birds carry the seeds far and wide, and the shrub spreads fast. It forms dense thickets that crowd out native plants and change the land. What was once planted with pride became an invasive headache that costs real money and real time to control. Now, a plant that sounds like the perfect backyard green until you remember how water connects everything. Water spinach, also called kangkong, grows fast and can be harvested again and again. Cut the stems and it regrows quickly. It tastes mild and works in stir-fries, soups, and curries. If you only think about a pot on a patio, it sounds perfect. But in warm regions, it can spread through waterways and clog irrigation systems, crowding out native aquatic plants. Even small fragments can start new growth. That is why it has been restricted in many places. A plant can be a kitchen staple and still be treated as a threat once it reaches natural water. Now comes a shrub that looks like a normal hedge but is treated like contraband. Khat has pointed green leaves and can grow neatly. In parts of East Africa and Arabia, chewing the leaves is a social tradition, but in the United States, it is treated as a controlled substance, and cultivation becomes a federal crime. This is another case where the plant is not evil in the soil. It is simply tied to law, and law does not care if your goal was a harmless garden experiment. Now picture a rose that turns into a fence you cannot walk through. Multiflora rose was planted as living fences and wildlife cover. It has rose hips, and during wartime shortages, rose hips were promoted as a vitamin source when citrus was harder to get. It seemed practical and beautiful at the same time. Then it took over. It forms thick, thorny thickets that can grow into walls, making land nearly impossible to move through. It crowds out native plants and changes fields and forests. Today, it is banned or controlled in many states, and homeowners spend thousands fighting what earlier generations planted with pride. Now, back underwater, where the next plant was once sold as a helpful aquarium addition. Hydrilla was used in aquariums and water gardens because it looked pretty and helped oxygenate water. It felt clean and useful. But it grows so densely that it blocks boat propellers, clogs water intake pipes, and creates stagnant conditions that harm fish. It spreads through fragments, so one broken piece can start a new infestation. That is why control costs have been massive, and why it is illegal to possess, transport, or sell in many places. Now a tropical palm that looks like a resort postcard. Betel nut palm produces small orange fruits with seeds that are traditionally chewed in parts of South and Southeast Asia as a stimulant habit. But long-term use has been tied to serious health problems, including oral cancers, and that is why it sits in a restricted category in U.S. policy conversations. It is not a common backyard plant, but it belongs on this list because it shows how a plant can be controlled for public health reasons, not for invasiveness. Now meet the innocent spring herb that turned into a forest bully. Garlic mustard has heart-shaped leaves and small white flowers. Settlers brought it as food and medicine. It was a useful spring green after long winters of preserved food, and it had that mild garlic taste people liked. But it spreads into dense carpets that smother native wildflowers and disrupt forest ecosystems. It also releases chemicals that interfere with other plants. Once it takes over a forest floor, diversity disappears. That is why it shows up on noxious weed lists across many regions. Now another aquatic invader that traveled through the aquarium world. Brazilian Elodea was valued for its look and fast growth. It seemed like a simple way to make water gardens feel alive. But it proved to be aggressive. It grows fast, crowds out native vegetation, and can fill water bodies until they become hard to use for recreation, irrigation, and wildlife. It spreads through tiny fragments, which makes it stubborn once it gets established. And now we end with the one that sounds like a survival food until it turns a lake into a hazard. Water chestnut produces starchy edible nuts that were once harvested as a food source along parts of the eastern seaboard. The nuts can be eaten and stored, and that makes it sound like a lost pantry crop. But in water, it forms dense mats that make lakes and ponds nearly unusable for swimming, boating, and fishing. Its sharp, spiny nuts can injure people and damage equipment. It crowds out native aquatic plants and changes habitat for fish and water birds. That is why many states run active removal programs and prohibit any cultivation or transport. These crops tell the story of how America learned the hard way that not all plants make good neighbors. Some hide deadly toxins, some burn skin, some spread like an unstoppable blanket, some are tied to drug law, others were planted with good intentions and turned into expensive disasters. If you want more forgotten garden history like this, subscribe. And tell me in the comments what plant you have seen taking over a yard, a ditch, or a pond near where you live, and whether anyone even knows its name.